Hello there. This is Pastor Carolyn with another one of our Old Testament Bible School stories. We're going to look at Elijah today. Elijah's story is found in 1st and 2nd Kings, and there's lots of stories about him, but we're just going to do a thumbnail sketch right quick about his life. It starts out in 1st Kings chapter 17, talking about Elijah being in the wilderness because God had caused a drought to come upon the land. And guess who fed him while he was in the wilderness? A raven. And so, as we see that Elijah is preparing for this ministry ahead of time and being fed by the ravens, he understands God's call to go into the town, and there he met a widow that had a young child, and he asked her if he could eat with them, and she said, well, yes, but I don't have much. I'm very poor. This might be my last meal. And so she took the last of her flour and oil and made them a modest supper. And Elijah was so touched by her generosity that he told her that she would never run out of her meal and oil. And sure enough, that's what happened. At one point during his stay with her, her little child became quite ill and was dying, and Elijah took that child and prayed to God for him, and God brought that child back to life. So we understand that Elijah is certainly a man of God. And about that time, he also went to King Ahab. Ahab was a king of various characteristics as well. He did some good things, but he was also not only a worshiper of the Lord our God, but he also allowed Baal worship, probably because he had married a woman from Phoenicia, an arranged marriage, for political and economic reasons. And she worshiped Baal and had brought not only her idols, but her priests with her. And so, as Elijah talked to him about this, he said, you can't worship both of these. He says, let's have a showdown. And he invited Ahab to send the priests of Baal. There was around 500 plus a few other hundred that served the goddess Asherah, and they went to the mountain to have this showdown to see once and for all who was the real God. And so the contest was that they built these altars, and then they prepared a bull and put upon the barbecue pit as such, and the test was which god would light the fire in that pit for the sacrifice. And Baal's priests went first, and they built this elaborate altar. They had everything fixed just right. They laid the meat out, and they began to pray to Baal. They danced. They called out to Baal. They even cut themselves, appealing to Baal to light the fire. But nothing happened. So at that point, Elijah said, okay. And he built a very simple altar made out of rocks, 12 of them, one for each tribe of Israel. And he dug a trench around that altar, and then he placed the meat up there, and he drenched the meat. And he prayed to God. He said, Lord, your people are watching. This is the time to show that you are the one true God. And God answered that prayer, and sure enough, fire came, and it did not only cook the meat, it totally burned up the meat and burned up the rocks for the altar and lapped up the water that they had placed around the trench of that altar. People were roaring and clapping, and it was a big celebration. And Elijah told them, "Get rid of these priests," and they did. In fact, they killed the priests of Baal and Asherah. When Jezebel heard this, she was not happy, and so she sent word to Elijah, "I will kill you. Just as you've done to my priests, I'm going to kill you." Well, this scared Elijah, and once again, he's headed toward the wilderness. God fed him on his journey, and he ended up in a cave at Mount Horeb. When Elijah was in that cave, he was told to go to the mouth of the cave, that God was going to meet him there. And so as he did that, there was this huge wind, kind of like a hurricane or something. I mean, just devastating wind. And God thought that that would get Elijah's attention, but God was not in that wind. And then there was an earthquake, and that also got Elijah's attention, and God thought, but I don't feel God there. And then there was fire, just a roaring fire. And once again, it was very impressive, but Elijah did not feel God in that fire. And then there was silence. Some translations say a small voice, and others say silence. And that's where God was. God asked Elijah when he first went to the mouth of the cave, "What are you doing here?" And then when he appeared to Elijah through the silence, he asked him again, "What are you doing here?" Just the presence of God prepared Elijah for the future. And he went to see Ahab again. Ahab had done fairly well. God had blessed him. He'd won a couple of battles. But on his way home from one of those battles, he happened to notice this vineyard that was adjacent to the property of his palace. And he wanted that vineyard for his vegetable garden. He decided that'd be a perfect place. He needed that extra land. And so he told the owner, Naboth, that he wanted that land, and he would either pay him or he'd get him a much better vineyard. But Naboth turned him down. He said, this has been in my family. This is our ancestral heritage, and I am not interested in selling it at all. So this just depresses Ahab. He goes home in a funk. He even goes to bed, and Jezebel said, "What is wrong with you?" And he told her about how he wanted that land, and she said, "Well, you're a king, just take it." He said, "No, I can't do that." So Jezebel said, "Don't worry, I'll get it for you." So what she did was she had false testimony about Naboth, and it was told that he blasphemed God, and that was a punishment that would cause him to be stoned. And sure enough, he was. And then she went and told him, "Well, now you can claim that land. Elijah heard about that, and he confronts him and talks to him, and Ahab's convicted. He repents. So God said, okay, I will not kill you, but your son will lose the kingdom. And he had said that Jezebel would die and the dogs would eat her, and he did not remove that punishment. There's other stories about Elijah, but we'll go to the end of his ministry. He has prepared another person to take his place. He has done what he can do to be the prophet, to try to bring the truth to his people. And so God took him up to heaven in a chariot of fire. One of the few people in the Bible that we understand did not die, but God took him straight to heaven. Elijah is much revered by the Jewish people, by Christians, and even by the Muslims. Elijah has a chair set for him at each Seder meal, at each ceremony of circumcision. We hear about Elijah as one of the prophets that came at the Transfiguration in the New Testament. There's much that we can learn from Elijah. He was a man of action, a man of nature, a man of contemplation, a man who had a relationship with God. You know, as we think about his actions and all he did to do that contest about the altars, about his confrontation of the king, he was quite brave. And then we hear about him searching for God in that cave. Let's hear some scripture about that. This comes from 1 Kings chapter 19. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Different aspects of the same man, a man who had a relationship with God. Prophets throughout history are often standing alone, loving God, loving the people, but feeling like no one is listening. It's easier to go around and want to please the crowd to have everybody love you. This altar contest evidently really wiped him out, and then to have his life threatened. No wonder he fled. And then, like Gideon and the fleece, trying to find out God's will, trying to find out what he should do, trying to reach out and get that assurance. Surely in that powerful wind, or surely in the fire, or surely in the earthquake. But no, God made his presence known through the silence. Did you notice that at the beginning of that scripture I just read, God asked Elijah, "What are you doing here?" And then at the end, the same question, "What are you doing here?" The first time, Elijah was hiding, worrying, freaking out. And the second time, renewed, refreshed, ready to go. Elijah was trying to do it on his own, under his own power. No wonder he was exhausted. But when he put his trust in God, when he felt God in the rest and in the silence, he became revived. You know, we're busy. We have to stand our ground sometimes. We have questions. And sometimes the pressures of the world, our children, our parents, our work, our church, all seem to pressure us at the same time. And we get tired. Sometimes we feel if we're standing alone, representing the goodness and grace of God, feeling frustrated that we are not able to communicate with those that we dearly love. We feel frustrated and tired. We'd like to just drive away into the sunset and escape all those responsibilities. And then God's grace. And then through God's grace, sometimes in the midst of the chaos, but more often in the quietness, we feel the presence of God. And we know God has this, that our God has us, and the burden's taken off our shoulders because we know that God takes care of our worries and God takes care of us. We can't demand God do anything, and we can't put God in a box. God surprises us all the time and does what God will do. What are we doing here? We're waiting on God. We're seeking God. Sometimes in the midst of the crazy, sometimes in our quiet place. Wherever we are, there God is. If we will notice, if we will practice, we can recognize the presence of God. We can only pray that we get to be a part of God's plans, that we will be blessed by being able to serve God, and that when we leave this earth in a chariot of fire or in a hospital bed, that we will be taken into the presence of God. May God bless you all.